My name is Daniel Mercer, and I've been the fire lookout on Granite Ridge long enough to know when something is off. You learn the difference between normal quiet and the kind that presses back against you, the kind that feels like a held breath. Tonight, the forest has been holding its breath since sunset, and I can't shake the sense that it's waiting for something to finish happening. The tower sits on steel legs driven into bedrock. For flights up, wrapped in glass that reflects my own face back at me when the light inside is on. I've shut most of it off. I don't like being a beacon. The radio hums low on standby, a sound so familiar it's almost comforting, and the smell of old pine boards and dust hangs in the air. Somewhere far below, a branch snaps. Not the sharp crack of an animal moving fast. Just a slow, deliberate sound, like weight being tested. I didn't know my lookout was under investigation until an unmarked SUV climbed the access road an hour before dark. No insignia, no plates I could read from the tower. It stopped at the gate, idled, then kept going like the gate had never been there. That alone should have been enough to put me on edge. Gates here stay locked unless someone with a key wants them open, and keys are counted. They're always counted. 2 men got out. Both wore the same gray jackets, plain enough to be forgettable, and both looked up at the tower at the exact same time. I remember noticing how still they stood, like they were listening for something I couldn't hear from that distance. When one of them finally spoke into his phone, I couldn't make out the words, but I saw his free hand lift, palm open, then lower again. A signal, maybe, or a habit. They didn't climb up. They walked the perimeter instead, slow circles beneath me, flashlights sweeping the brush. Their beams cut clean lines through the trees, catching on reflective tape I'd forgotten was there. I watched them from above, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold, feeling like I was trespassing in my own post. The radio crackled once, sharp enough to make me flinch. Not a call, just a burst of static that rose and fell, then settled back into its hum. I reached for the mic out of instinct and stopped myself. Protocol says you answer calls, not noise. Protocol also says federal agencies don't show up unannounced to a fire lookout in the middle of a dry season. Not unless something has already gone wrong. By the time the sun slipped behind the ridge, the men were gone. The SUV rolled back down the road without headlights, tires whispering over gravel. The gate swung shut behind it on its own, metal tapping metal, a sound that carried farther than it should have. After that, the forest went quiet in a way I've only felt a few times before, like a storm that decides not to break. I tried to settle into routine, logged wind speed, scanned the horizon for smoke, made notes about the haze pooling low in the valleys. The light changed the way it always does, colors draining out until the world turned into shapes and edges. The glass around me cooled, and the tower creaked as the temperature dropped. Each sound landed harder in the silence. The smell came next. Not smoke, not rot. Something clean and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. Even though the sky was clear, it seeped in through the vents, faint but persistent, and I caught myself sniffing like I could identify it if I concentrated hard enough. Couldn't. It just made my scalp prickle. At 9:17, my radio came alive on a channel I don't use. A calm voice, male, practiced, asked me to confirm my position. He didn't use my call sign. He used my name. Not a question. A statement. I waited a beat too long before answering, and when I did, my voice sounded smaller than it should have in the room. He said they were conducting a review. He said there was nothing I needed to do differently. He said I might notice activity below the tower and asked me not to interfere. His words were careful, arranged like they'd been used before. When I asked what prompted the review, the channel went quiet long enough for me to hear my own breathing. "Maintain observation," he said finally. Then the radio clicked off. I paced. 3 steps to the window, 3 back. The tower felt tighter, like the walls had moved in a few inches. Outside, a light blinked on deep in the trees, far beyond the range of any camp or road. It wasn't steady. Brightened, dimmed, then went dark. I marked the bearing automatically, the way I always do, and hesitated before writing anything down. Some instinct told me that records mattered more tonight than they ever had, and that cutting corners would be noticed. Another light answered it from a different direction, lower, closer to the slope. Not a fire. Too controlled. Too cold. I leaned closer to the glass and felt a subtle pressure change, like my ears needed to pop. The air itself seemed heavier, thick with unsaid things. At 10:02, footsteps sounded on the stairs. That happens. Hikers get lost. Rangers check in. I told myself that as the steps climbed, slow and measured, each one landing with the same weight. No pauses. No missteps. When the footsteps stopped at the trapdoor, the silence that followed felt deliberate. I waited for a knock that didn't come. Instead, a voice rose from below, not loud, not strained. "Daniel," it said, and I knew without knowing how that it wasn't a question. I didn't answer. I watched the lights in the forest flicker again, closer now, and thought about the men in gray jackets and the way they'd looked up at the tower like it was a lid on something they didn't want opened. The smell sharpened. The radio hummed. The trapdoor remained closed. Whatever was happening, it was happening all at once, and I was standing at the center of it, expected to observe, expected to stay still, expected to understand later. I stayed where I was, one hand resting on the desk, the other hovering near the radio, listening to the silence settle after my name had been spoken. The voice below didn't repeat itself. It didn't knock. Whoever was on the stairs seemed content to wait, like time was another tool they knew how to use better than I did. The trapdoor handle didn't move. That detail stuck with me. Anyone actually trying to come up would test it, rattle it, make some sign of intent. Instead, there was only the faint sound of breathing from below, so quiet it blended into the tower's own low creaks. I focused on the smell again, sharper now, metallic at the back of my throat, the kind of scent you get near electrical equipment that's running hotter than it should. Outside, the lights multiplied, not all at once. One would flare briefly and die, then another would answer from a different angle, like someone checking sightlines. I counted at least 5 distinct sources before I lost track. They never stayed still long enough to fix on them with binoculars. When I tried, the pressure in my ears deepened, and I had to lower the lenses to swallow against it. At 10:21, the radio clicked back on by itself. Same channel, same calm voice. He told me they had personnel on site and asked me to confirm there was no active fire. The question felt ceremonial. I gave the answer anyway, steady, factual, the way you're trained to speak when you don't want emotion leaking through. He acknowledged it and added, almost as an afterthought, that stair traffic was expected and should not be logged as a visitor interaction. I looked at the logbook open to a clean page. The pen lay across it, exactly where I'd left it. Not logging something feels different from choosing not to. It leaves a space you can feel later. I closed the book instead and slid it under the desk, out of sight, like that might make the omission less real. The breathing below the trapdoor stopped. I waited for footsteps going back down, for some sign of movement. Nothing came. Minutes stretched thin. The tower's glass reflected my own outline back at me, warped by darkness, and for the first time all night I turned off the desk lamp completely. The interior fell into shadow, and the forest outside seemed to lean closer, details emerging that light usually keeps at bay. A shape moved at the edge of the clearing, too tall for a person standing upright, too narrow to be a vehicle. It crossed between trees and vanished. When another followed, lower and faster, I realized they were carrying equipment slung over shoulders, silhouettes breaking apart and reforming as they moved. Coordinated, quiet. I felt a vibration through the tower legs, subtle but persistent, like something heavy being set down carefully, then adjusted. The smell spiked again, and with it came a faint hum, not from my radio, not from anything inside the cab. It rose from below, through the metal and wood, a frequency you feel more than hear. My teeth ached. I tried calling down to them, just a simple request to identify themselves. My voice sounded wrong in the space, too loud, and it fell straight down through the trapdoor opening without echo. No one answered. Instead, the radio crackled, and the same voice reminded me, gently this time, to maintain observation. I moved to the north-facing window and scanned the ridgeline. The horizon looked unchanged, stars sharp and cold. Then one star dimmed. Not blinked out, just dulled. Like someone had turned a dial. Another followed. I realized something was blocking my view, high above the treetops, not moving fast enough to register as motion until I focused on the edges of absence where light should have been. My throat tightened. There was no explanation that fit comfortably, so my mind reached for the least alarming one and failed. The shape overhead resolved into nothing identifiable, just a broadening shadow that made the night feel closer, heavier. The pressure in my ears became painful, and I had to sit down, palms flat on the floor, breathing shallow until it eased. At 11:03, there was a knock on the trapdoor. One knock, firm, professional. It sounded like authority. I didn't answer. The handle turned slowly, testing, then stopped. Whoever was below seemed to decide something in that moment. The knock didn't repeat. Instead, the radio came alive again, a different voice this time. Female, younger. She asked me to confirm whether I had experienced any unusual sensory phenomena since sunset. The phrasing was precise. I asked what qualified as unusual. She paused, then said anything related to light, sound, pressure, or perceived presence. The words lined up with my own observations too neatly to be coincidence. I told her about the lights. I told her about the pressure. I did not tell her about the voice using my name or the breathing beneath the floor. When I finished, she thanked me and said they would proceed accordingly. Before the channel went dead, she added that I should avoid looking directly below the tower for the next several hours. That instruction landed harder than anything else had. It echoed something old, something I'd half forgotten from a manual revision years back, a line item that had been removed without comment. I stayed seated, eyes level, resisting the urge to glance down through the floorboards that never quite meet flush. The hum intensified. Tools clinked somewhere beneath me, metal on metal, controlled and careful. A beam of light cut upward through the cracks in the floor for just a second, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended, unmoving, like the air itself had decided to stop participating. I thought about leaving, about climbing down the ladder and walking into the dark until the tower was just another shape behind me. The idea felt impossible not because of fear, but because of expectation. I had been told to observe, to stay, and somewhere between the unmarked SUV and the first knock on the trapdoor, that instruction had hardened into something heavier. At 11:47, the lights in the forest went out all at once. The sudden absence left my eyes straining, searching for reference points that weren't there anymore. The hum dropped to a low murmur. The pressure eased. From below, I finally heard footsteps again, moving away this time, descending the stairs in the same measured rhythm they'd climbed. I waited until the last sound faded into the trees. I did not look down. I sat in the dark, listening to my own breathing, and understood that whatever they were investigating, the investigation wasn't about the tower keeping me safe. It was about keeping something else exactly where it was, and making sure I stayed above it, watching. I stayed where I was, one hand resting on the desk, the other hovering near the radio, listening to the silence settle after my name had been spoken. The voice below didn't repeat itself. It didn't knock. Whoever was on the stairs seemed content to wait, like time was another tool they knew how to use better than I did. The trapdoor handle didn't move. That detail stuck with me. Anyone actually trying to come up would test it, rattle it, make some sign of intent. Instead, there was only the faint sound of breathing from below, so quiet it blended into the tower's own low creaks. I focused on the smell again, sharper now, metallic at the back of my throat. The kind of scent you get near electrical equipment that's running hotter than it should. Outside, the lights multiplied, not all at once. One would flare briefly and die, then another would answer from a different angle, like someone checking sightlines. I counted at least 5 distinct sources before I lost track. They never stayed still long enough to fix on them with binoculars. When I tried, the pressure in my ears deepened, and I had to lower the lenses to swallow against it. At 10:21, the radio clicked back on by itself. Same channel, same calm voice. He told me they had personnel on site and asked me to confirm there was no active fire. The question felt ceremonial. I gave the answer anyway, steady, factual, the way you're trained to speak when you don't want emotion leaking through. He acknowledged it and added, almost as an afterthought, that stair traffic was expected and should not be logged as a visitor interaction. I looked at the logbook open to a clean page. The pen lay across it, exactly where I'd left it. Not logging something feels different from choosing not to. It leaves a space you can feel later. I closed the book instead and slid it under the desk, out of sight, like that might make the omission less real. The breathing below the trapdoor stopped. I waited for footsteps going back down, for some sign of movement. Nothing came. Minutes stretched thin. The tower's glass reflected my own outline back at me, warped by darkness, and for the first time all night I turned off the desk lamp completely. The interior fell into shadow, and the forest outside seemed to lean closer, details emerging that light usually keeps at bay. A shape moved at the edge of the clearing, too tall for a person standing upright, too narrow to be a vehicle. It crossed between trees and vanished. When another followed, lower and faster, I realized they were carrying equipment slung over shoulders, silhouettes breaking apart and reforming as they moved. Coordinated, quiet. I felt a vibration through the tower legs, subtle but persistent, like something heavy being set down carefully, then adjusted. The smell spiked again, and with it came a faint hum, not from my radio, not from anything inside the cab. It rose from below, through the metal and wood, a frequency you feel more than hear. My teeth ached. I tried calling down to them, just a simple request to identify themselves. My voice sounded wrong in the space, too loud, and it fell straight down through the trapdoor opening without echo. No one answered. Instead, the radio crackled, and the same voice reminded me, gently this time, to maintain observation. I moved to the north-facing window and scanned the ridgeline. The horizon looked unchanged, stars sharp and cold. Then one star dimmed. Not blinked out, just dulled. Like someone had turned a dial. Another followed. I realized something was blocking my view, high above the treetops, not moving fast enough to register as motion until I focused on the edges of absence where light should have been. My throat tightened. There was no explanation that fit comfortably, so my mind reached for the least alarming one and failed. The shape overhead resolved into nothing identifiable, just a broadening shadow that made the night feel closer, heavier. The pressure in my ears became painful, and I had to sit down, palms flat on the floor, breathing shallow until it eased. At 11:03, there was a knock on the trapdoor. One knock, firm, professional. It sounded like authority. I didn't answer. The handle turned slowly, testing, then stopped. Whoever was below seemed to decide something in that moment. The knock didn't repeat. Instead, the radio came alive again. A different voice this time. Female. Younger. She asked me to confirm whether I had experienced any unusual sensory phenomena since sunset. The phrasing was precise. I asked what qualified as unusual. She paused, then said anything related to light, sound, pressure, or perceived presence. The words lined up with my own observations too neatly to be coincidence. I told her about the lights. I told her about the pressure. I did not tell her about the voice using my name or the breathing beneath the floor. When I finished, she thanked me and said they would proceed accordingly. Before the channel went dead, she added that I should avoid looking directly below the tower for the next several hours. That instruction landed harder than anything else had. It echoed something old, something I'd half forgotten from a manual revision years back. A line item that had been removed without comment. I stayed seated, eyes level, resisting the urge to glance down through the floorboards that never quite meet flush. The hum intensified. Tools clinked somewhere beneath me, metal on metal, controlled and careful. A beam of light cut upward through the cracks in the floor for just a second, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended, unmoving, like the air itself had decided to stop participating. I thought about leaving, about climbing down the ladder and walking into the dark until the tower was just another shape behind me. The idea felt impossible not because of fear, but because of expectation. I had been told to observe, to stay, and somewhere between the unmarked SUV and the first knock on the trapdoor, that instruction had hardened into something heavier. At 11:47, the lights in the forest went out all at once. The sudden absence left my eyes straining, searching for reference points that weren't there anymore. The hum dropped to a low murmur. The pressure eased. From below, I finally heard footsteps again, moving away this time, descending the stairs in the same measured rhythm they'd climbed. I waited until the last sound faded into the trees. I did not look down. I sat in the dark, listening to my own breathing, and understood that whatever they were investigating, the investigation wasn't about the tower keeping me safe. It was about keeping something else exactly where it was, and making sure I stayed above it, watching. After the footsteps disappeared, the tower didn't return to normal. Silence came back wrong, layered and uneven, like the forest was still listening for instructions. I stayed seated on the floor longer than made sense, back against the wall, eyes fixed on the opposite window. My legs tingled from holding still. I didn't move until the hum beneath me thinned to something I could mistake for wind. I checked my watch. Midnight had passed without ceremony. The night felt stretched, pulled thin in places, thick in others. Time still moved, but it didn't flow. The radio stayed quiet. No standby hiss, no accidental clicks. I tapped the casing once with my knuckle. Nothing. I didn't try to fix it. A working radio meant answers, and answers felt like something I wasn't supposed to have yet. Outside, a pale wash of light crept across the lower treeline. Not a beam, more like reflected spill, as if floodlights were aimed at the ground beyond my line of sight. The glow rose and fell subtly, responding to movement I couldn't see. Shadows of trunks stretched and shortened. The clearing below the tower, the one I'd been told not to look into, brightened around the edges. I stood up slowly, testing the floorboards with my weight. They felt solid, normal. The smell lingered, though softer now, like it had soaked into the wood. When I stepped closer to the window, my reflection appeared again, ghosted over the forest. My face looked unfamiliar in the dark, eyes too bright, expression caught halfway between focus and fatigue. A vehicle door slammed somewhere below. Then another. Voices followed, low and clipped, overlapping in short bursts. I couldn't make out words, but I recognized the cadence of coordination. A team that had done this before. Metal scraped against metal. Something heavy was dragged, paused, adjusted. The pressure in my ears returned in short pulses, like someone testing the edges of it. At 12:26, the radio clicked once. No voice, just a brief open channel that let in a sound I hadn't heard before. A deep, steady tone, far below the range of speech, like machinery idling at a distance, carried a sense of scale that made my chest tighten. The channel closed again before I could react. I wrote anyway, not in the official log. On a scrap of paper torn from an old checklist, pencil pressing hard enough to leave grooves. Times, lights, pressure, instructions. I avoided adjectives. I stuck to facts the way I'd been trained, because facts feel safer when you don't trust the context around them. The light below intensified. I caught myself leaning forward, weight shifting toward the window, and stopped. The instruction echoed again, clear as if it had just been spoken. Avoid looking directly below the tower. I didn't know how literal that was supposed to be, but I wasn't eager to find out. Instead, I watched the perimeter. Figures moved in and out of the spill, their outlines breaking apart when they crossed behind equipment. One of them stopped and looked up. Even from this distance, I felt it, a direct line of attention snapping into place. He didn't wave, didn't signal. He just stood there until another figure approached and guided him away, a hand firm on his shoulder. Something shifted beneath the tower. Not footsteps this time. A weight transfer, deliberate, followed by a sound like air being forced through a narrow space. The floor vibrated, a slow, controlled oscillation that made the glass rattle in its frames. My teeth buzzed. I gripped the desk until it stopped. I thought about the manual again, about the sections that get revised quietly without explanation, about how you're told to trust that someone else has more information than you do. The idea had always been comforting. Tonight, it felt like a liability. At 1:04, the female voice returned on the radio. She asked me to confirm that I was still in the cab and that I had not descended the stairs. Her tone hadn't changed, but there was a new edge to it, a tension she didn't bother hiding. I confirmed. She acknowledged and told me to remain where I was until further notice. When I asked how long that might be, she said they were nearing the end of the operation. Operation. The word sat heavy. The pressure built steadily after that. Not painful, just insistent, like standing at altitude without acclimating. I breathed slow, shallow, counting seconds to keep myself grounded. Outside, the forest lights dimmed, then flared brighter than before. For a moment, shadows vanished entirely. The trees reduced to flat silhouettes. I heard something then that didn't fit. A sound that reminded me of wind moving through a confined space, but rhythmic, almost patterned. It rose from below and traveled up the tower legs, resolving into a vibration that set my bones humming. I pressed my palms to the glass and felt it there too, as if the whole structure was acting as a conduit. The sound cut off abruptly. The lights snapped down to a low glow. The pressure eased in a rush that left me dizzy. I stumbled back and sat hard on the floor, lungs dragging in air like I'd been underwater. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the trapdoor handle turned. Slowly, carefully, not testing this time. Opening. I stared at the seam where the door met the floor, every muscle locked. The hinges creaked just enough to register, and a thin line of light spilled into the cab, slicing through dust and shadow. I could hear breathing again, closer now, accompanied by the faint rustle of fabric. "Stay where you are," a voice said from below. Not the one that had used my name earlier. This one was older, rougher, edged with authority that didn't bother being polite. "This won't take long." The door opened a few inches more, then stopped. I could see a shoulder, the edge of a helmet, a gloved hand resting on the ladder rung. The man didn't climb up. He looked around from his position, eyes tracking the room, the windows, the desk. He told me the site would be restricted moving forward, that there would be changes, new protocols, additional oversight. He said my cooperation was appreciated and expected. When I asked what they were containing, he paused just long enough for the question to feel like a mistake. "We're stabilizing a situation," he said. "That's all you need to know." He closed the trapdoor without waiting for a response. The latch clicked into place from below. Footsteps descended. The light vanished. By 2:10, the forest lights were gone. The clearing returned to darkness. The smell faded. The hum never came back. I stood at the window, watching the treeline settle into stillness, feeling like I was looking at something that had been put back slightly wrong. The radio remained dead. I stayed in the tower until dawn because there was nowhere else to go, and because I understood now what observation really meant. It wasn't about watching for fire. It was about being present, being a marker, a fixed point above something that other people worked very hard to keep out of sight. When the first light touched the ridge, an unmarked SUV rolled back down the access road. The gate closed behind it. The forest exhaled. I didn't look down. The light on the ridge thinned again, like it had second thoughts, and the night pulled itself back together. Dawn didn't arrive. It hovered, stalled somewhere beyond the horizon, leaving the sky a deep, bruised blue that refused to turn. The forest stayed dark, the kind of dark that isn't empty, just restrained. I checked my watch. 2:38. Time was still moving in numbers, even if it had stopped behaving like itself. The radio was a dead weight on the desk. No hiss, no static. I lifted the handset and set it back down, more out of habit than hope. The silence that followed felt deliberate, curated. I wondered if it was part of the operation, or if the equipment had simply decided it had done enough for one night. Outside, fog began to gather in the low places. It didn't roll in the way fog usually does, spilling and climbing, pooled. It filled the negative space between trees and stayed there, smooth and unmoving, like water held behind glass. The smell shifted with it, less metallic now, more damp, carrying the cold of the ground. I forced myself back into routine. Logged weather, logged visibility. The act of writing steadied me, even when the entries felt like a performance. Wind calm, no smoke visible, visibility limited by fog in lower elevations. All true, none of it helpful. At 3:01, a single light appeared again in the forest. Not where it had been before, closer to the tower, low to the ground. It didn't flicker, it didn't move, it just existed, a pale disk hovering at knee height between the trunks. I marked the bearing automatically and stopped myself from adding commentary. The urge to explain felt dangerous. A second light joined it, then a third. They formed a loose arc, all facing inward toward something I couldn't see. I felt the pressure change again, subtle this time, like a shift in weather rather than altitude. My ears popped once, softly. The fog responded. It drew back from the lights, retreating in smooth lines that left the forest floor exposed in patches. The clearing below the tower brightened at the edges again, though no floodlights were visible. The illumination felt indirect, borrowed. I heard voices, farther out now, scattered, not coordinated like before. Short exchanges that ended quickly. A different phase of the same work. something winding down or something being handed off. I caught a single word carried upward by the still air. Secure. The tower vibrated once. A low shudder that traveled up through the legs and into the cab. Not a test. Not equipment being moved. Felt like a response. I stepped away from the window and leaned my forehead against the cool glass, eyes closed. The pressure behind my eyes eased when I did that, like the night preferred I not watch too closely. I stayed like that until the glass fogged with my breath. When I opened my eyes, the lights had shifted. The arc had tightened, drawing closer together. The space they enclosed felt heavier, darker, like the absence of light had depth to it. I realized I was holding my breath and let it out slowly, counting. At 3:27, the radio came back to life. Not the calm male voice, not the younger woman. This one was new, older, tired. He didn't bother with protocol. He told me they were extending the restriction through the rest of the night and asked me to confirm I understood. The word night landed oddly, like an assumption that time still mattered. I confirmed. He paused, then added that I might experience further anomalies and that none of them required action on my part. If it becomes difficult, he said, choosing the word carefully, focus on the horizon. The channel closed before I could ask what counted as difficult. I did what he said. I fixed my gaze on the distant ridgeline, on the places where the forest broke against rock and sky. The stars there were duller than they should have been, as if seen through a thin veil. One by one they sharpened again, the night conceding small details. Below, the lights dimmed in unison. One went out, then another. The last remained for a long moment, isolated and stubborn, before it too faded. The fog rushed back into the spaces they left, quicker this time, like it had been waiting. I sagged against the desk, the tension bleeding out of me in a wave that left my hands shaking. The smell dissipated almost completely, replaced by cold pine and damp earth. The forest began to sound like itself again. A distant call, the soft movement of something small in the brush. Ordinary noise, restored carefully, like a set being reset between scenes. At 4:02, footsteps returned to the stairs. Not measured this time, not synchronized. One person moving quickly, boots catching on the metal treads. I stood, every muscle alert, and waited. The steps stopped short of the trapdoor. A hand slapped the side of the tower, a sharp, frustrated sound. Tower! A voice called up, breathless. Not using my name, not using authority. Just a person suddenly very human. We need confirmation. I didn't answer right away. I didn't know which confirmation he meant. Fire status. My presence. Something else entirely. Before I could decide, the radio clicked. Stand by, the tired voice said. We're handling it. There was a brief exchange below, voices overlapping. One calm, one strained. Then the footsteps descended again, faster this time. The tower settled back into stillness. I went back to the window. The fog thinned gradually, lifting just enough to reveal the clearing beneath the tower. I stopped myself inches from looking straight down, heart pounding, and shifted my focus outward instead. The perimeter looked undisturbed. No tracks I could see from this height. No equipment left behind. Whatever had been there had been removed cleanly. The pressure didn't return. The hum stayed gone. The night loosened its grip in small increments, the sky lightening by degrees so subtle they felt imagined. My watch ticked toward morning like it always had, stubbornly normal. I understood then that the investigation wasn't over. It had just moved into a quieter phase. One that didn't require lights or voices or knocking on trapdoors. One that relied on routines resuming, on reports filed without comment, on a lookout staying exactly where he was supposed to be. When the first actual hint of dawn finally edged the sky, it felt earned, like permission rather than inevitability. I stayed at the window, eyes on the horizon, and waited for the forest to decide what kind of day it was going to be. The sky lightened enough to suggest morning without committing to it. A thin gradient crept in from the east, blue pressing against black, but the sun stayed hidden, as if it was waiting for a signal it hadn't received yet. The forest didn't wake the way it usually does. No sudden swell of birdsong, just a careful reintroduction of sound, one element at a time. I felt wrung out, not tired exactly, more like my body had been holding a posture for too long and didn't know how to let go of it. I rolled my shoulders, stretched my fingers, and listened to the small sounds my joints made in the quiet cab. They felt too loud. Everything human did. The radio remained silent. I stopped expecting it to come back on, and that, more than anything else, unsettled me. Silence with context is manageable. Silence without it feels like an omission. I made coffee even though I didn't want it. The smell helped ground the space, overriding the last traces of metal and dampness. Steam fogged the glass, and for a moment my reflection disappeared entirely. I hadn't realized how much I'd been watching myself until I didn't have to anymore. Outside, the fog thinned into threads that drifted between the trees, lifting just enough to reveal the ground in uneven patches. I scanned automatically, cataloging shapes and distances, forcing my mind back into its trained grooves. No smoke, no movement that didn't belong. The clearing below the tower remained conspicuously empty, too clean, like a room that's been rearranged and put back exactly where it started. At 4:41, I noticed something small and wrong. A strip of reflective tape on a tree trunk at the edge of the clearing, low enough that it wouldn't be visible from a vehicle, high enough to catch light from above. It hadn't been there yesterday. I was sure of it. I'd memorized that perimeter the way you memorize a familiar face. This was new. I didn't log it. Instead, I marked the tree in my head and kept scanning. The urge to write it down came back stronger a few seconds later, sharper like a reflex trying to fire. I resisted it and felt a faint, irrational sense of relief when nothing immediately reacted to that decision. The pressure returned briefly, a soft squeeze behind the eyes that faded as quickly as it came. I leaned back from the window and focused on the ridge again, on the slow, inevitable approach of daylight. The tired voice's instruction echoed, uninvited, and I followed it without questioning why. At 5:03, a helicopter passed far to the south. High altitude, no running lights. I heard it more than saw it. A distant thrum that blended into the background noise if you weren't listening for it. It didn't approach the tower. It didn't change course. It just crossed the sky and disappeared, leaving the air feeling briefly disturbed, like ripples after a stone sinks. The forest answered with sound this time. A bird called from somewhere downslope, tentative, then another responded. The day was trying to start. I let myself believe it might succeed. I checked the stairs, not by opening the trapdoor, just by listening. No breathing, no movement. The tower legs were still, their usual faint vibration from wind and thermal shift returning like an old habit. I rested my hand on the floorboards and felt nothing unusual. Solid, unremarkable, the way I wanted it to be. At 5:26, the radio crackled. I didn't reach for it right away. I waited through 2 bursts of static, letting the sound prove it was real. When I finally lifted the handset, the younger woman's voice came through, quieter than before, like she was speaking from somewhere enclosed. She told me the site was cleared for normal operations at first light. She told me there would be a follow-up review later in the season. She told me not to discuss the night's events with anyone, including other rangers, until I received further instruction. The list was delivered calmly, efficiently, like a closing checklist. I asked her if the restriction about looking below the tower was still in effect. She paused longer than I expected. When she answered, her voice had lost some of its practiced neutrality. "Not anymore," she said. "That phase is complete." The channel went dead. I stood there with the handset in my hand long after the silence returned, feeling like something had shifted without my consent. Permission granted after the fact doesn't feel like permission. It feels like documentation. The sky finally committed to dawn. A thin line of pale orange edged the ridge, spreading slowly, carefully. Shadows softened. Details returned. The forest looked almost normal again, if you didn't know what to look for. I approached the window facing the clearing below the tower and stopped myself just short of leaning forward. My pulse ticked up, anticipation mixing with a dread I couldn't justify anymore. The instruction was lifted. The night was ending. There was no reason not to. I looked. First, I saw nothing. Just dirt and rock and the faint impression of where fog had been resting. Then my eyes adjusted, and patterns emerged. The ground was scuffed in wide arcs, shallow but deliberate, like something heavy had been shifted back and forth under control. There were marks where equipment had stood, weight impressed into the soil and then removed. No footprints, no tracks leading away. In the center of it all, directly beneath the tower, the earth looked wrong. Not disturbed, compacted, smoothed, as if pressed flat from below rather than above. The effect radiated outward in a rough circle, subtle enough that you could miss it if you weren't looking for it, obvious once you were. I stepped back, heart racing, and forced my eyes away. The pressure behind them returned immediately, sharper this time, and eased only when I focused on the ridge again. I understood then why the instruction had existed, and why it had been lifted only after daylight began to dilute the night. Whatever they had stabilized didn't like being observed directly. Or maybe it didn't like being remembered. The sun crested the ridge a few minutes later, thin light spilling into the cab and warming the glass. The tower looked the way it always had in daylight. Harmless, utilitarian. I took a long breath and let it out slowly, grounding myself in the ordinary. The sun crested the ridge a few minutes later, thin light spilling into the cab and warming the glass. The tower looked the way it always had in daylight. Harmless, utilitarian. I took a long breath and let it out slowly, grounding myself in the ordinary. My shift ended at 7. I stayed until then, logging what I was allowed to log, scanning for smoke that never came, listening to the forest fully wake. When the relief ranger's vehicle finally appeared on the access road, marked and familiar, I felt a flicker of something like gratitude. As I packed up to descend, I paused at the trapdoor and rested my hand on the latch. Felt normal, cool metal, no resistance. I climbed down without incident, boots ringing against the stairs, and stepped onto the ground. I didn't cross the clearing. I walked the long way around instead, keeping the tower at my back, eyes on the tree line, already aware that the night hadn't really ended. It had just receded, filed away under procedures and protocols, waiting for the next time someone decided to look too closely. The sun crested the ridge a few minutes later, thin light spilling into the cab and warming the glass. The tower looked the way it always had in daylight. Harmless, utilitarian. I took a long breath and let it out slowly, grounding myself in the ordinary. The relief ranger didn't ask many questions. He never does. That's part of the job. You trade details for continuity, keep the handoff clean. I gave him the basics. Weather steady, no smoke, fog in the low areas lifting. I didn't mention the tape on the tree or the ground beneath the tower. I didn't mention the lights or the voices or the way the night had pressed back when I paid too much attention. He nodded, signed the log, and climbed the stairs without looking up at me. I watched him go, counting each step until the trapdoor closed above his head. The sound of it settling into place felt heavier than it should have. I didn't leave right away. The access road was empty, quiet in that early morning way where even the gravel seems reluctant to make noise. The forest had resumed its daytime habits, but there was a hesitation to it, like an orchestra tuning up after an interruption. I set my pack down and stood there for a minute, letting the tower loom behind me, trying to decide which direction felt less wrong. I chose the longer route, the one that kept me on the ridgeline instead of cutting through the lower ground. It added distance, but it kept my line of sight away from the clearing. That felt important, even if I couldn't articulate why anymore. The instruction had been lifted, but the habit remained, embedded deeper than reason. As I walked, I noticed how clean everything was. Not pristine, not untouched, just orderly. Fallen needles lay where they should. Branches rested at natural angles. The forest floor looked like it had been brushed, gently, with a wide hand. The more I looked for disruption, the more I found its absence. The tape caught the light again through the trees. I stopped without meaning to. From this angle, it was barely visible, just a suggestion of reflection on bark. A marker meant to be seen only by someone who knew where to look. I stared at it until the pressure nudged behind my eyes, then forced myself to move on. By the time I reached the maintenance shed near the junction, the sun was fully up. Daylight flattened the world, drained it of the depth the night had given it. The fear receded with it, leaving behind something colder and harder to place. Not relief, more like a ledger entry balanced but not explained. My truck started on the first turn. The sound felt indecently loud after hours of careful listening. I drove with the windows down, letting the air wash through the cab, carrying pine and dust and the faint promise of heat later in the day. Mile by mile, the tower disappeared behind me, swallowed by the ridge. The radio crackled as I passed the first switchback. I nearly swerved. It wasn't the Forest Service frequency. It wasn't any channel I recognized. Just a brief burst of static, then silence. I slowed anyway, heart climbing, and listened. Nothing followed. I told myself it was interference, atmospheric conditions, a leftover echo. The explanations lined up easily now that the sun was out. They didn't stick. At the bottom of the road, a temporary sign had been erected overnight. White, official-looking, planted cleanly into the dirt. Area restricted. No trespassing. No logo. No agency name. Just authority implied by font and placement. I stopped long enough to read it twice, then drove on. I didn't go home. I stopped at the ranger station, even though my shift was technically over. The building smelled like coffee and paper and familiar boredom. 2 desks were occupied. Conversation drifted and overlapped. It felt almost jarring, stepping back into a world where people spoke freely, where silence wasn't loaded. I filed my report, the official one. Weather, visibility, nothing to note. My supervisor skimmed it, initialed the bottom, and slid it into a stack without comment. He asked if everything was okay up there. I said yes. The word came out smoothly, practiced already. On my way out, I noticed a new binder on the shelf behind the counter. Gray. Unlabeled. Too new to have been there yesterday. I paused, fingers hovering, then thought better of it and kept walking. Some curiosities come with consequences you don't get to choose. Outside, my phone buzzed. No signal had reached the tower all night. The sudden return of it felt intrusive. The notification wasn't a message. It was a calendar update. A block of time added 3 weeks from now. Site review, Granite Ridge. No organizer listed. No option to decline. I locked the phone and slipped it into my pocket, the weight of it suddenly noticeable. The drive home passed without incident. Traffic picked up. A logging truck thundered past in the opposite direction, rattling my mirrors. Ordinary things reasserted themselves aggressively, as if daring me to challenge them. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the night felt unreal, like a story told too early in the morning to stick. I showered. The water ran clear. I stood under it longer than necessary, letting the heat sink into my shoulders, scrubbing until my skin reddened. The smell lingered faintly no matter what soap I used, a ghost of metal and cold earth that refused to be rinsed away entirely. I slept for a few hours. Not deeply. Dreams came in fragments. Light without source. Pressure without pain. The sense of being observed from below rather than above. I woke with my jaw clenched and the echo of the tower's hum vibrating somewhere in my bones. When I checked the time, it was still the same day. That realization landed hard. The entire night, stretched and compressed and segmented by voices and lights, had not broken the calendar. It was contained within a single date, a single line item, as tidy as the clearing beneath the tower. In the afternoon, a knock came at my door. 2 men stood on the porch. Gray jackets. Plain. Forgettable. They introduced themselves by last name only and asked if they could come in. Their eyes moved past me into the house without waiting for permission, cataloging space the way professionals do. They didn't sit. They didn't threaten. They asked me to recount the night in my own words. Not for accuracy, they said, for completeness. I chose each sentence carefully, leaving gaps where the pressure returned, where my ears rang softly as if in warning. They nodded at the right places, took notes I couldn't see. When I finished, one of them told me I'd done well, that my adherence to protocol had been noted, that I was not under investigation. The distinction mattered, he said, and held my gaze long enough to make sure I understood what he wasn't saying. Before they left, the other man asked if I'd noticed anything unusual beneath the tower after daylight. I said no. He watched my face for a beat too long, then smiled without warmth and thanked me for my time. After they were gone, the house felt too quiet. I stood in the doorway and listened to the sounds of the neighborhood resume. A car starting, a dog barking, ordinary life, loud and insistent. Somewhere on the ridge, the tower stood exactly where it always had, legs sunk into bedrock, cab catching the sun. Above something that had been pressed flat and smoothed over and left behind. My next shift was scheduled for the following week. I didn't request a transfer, not because I wasn't afraid, because observation, once assigned, doesn't end just because the night does. The day wore on like a bandage that didn't quite stick. I moved through errands on autopilot, nodded at people I recognized, answered questions that didn't matter. By late afternoon, the light began to thin again, shadows stretching the way they always do when evening decides to arrive, whether you're ready or not. I hadn't planned to go back up the ridge so soon. I told myself that more than once. It didn't change where my truck ended up pointing. The access road was open. No cones. No barricades. The temporary sign at the bottom was gone. The post pulled cleanly from the dirt as if it had never been there. That absence bothered me more than if it had remained. Erasure takes intention. As I climbed, the radio stayed quiet. No stray bursts of static. No accidental overlap with frequencies that didn't belong. The forest settled into dusk with practiced ease, colors draining out, depth returning. I recognized the feeling in my chest as something close to anticipation and didn't like that I couldn't separate it from dread. By the time I parked at the turnout, night had closed in fully. The sky was clear, stars sharp. Too sharp. I killed the engine and sat there, hands on the wheel, listening to the tick of cooling metal. The tower rose above the treeline ahead, a familiar silhouette. The windows were dark. That was normal. It still felt like a statement. I didn't turn on my headlamp until I reached the base. The beam caught on bark and rock and the lower steps of the stairs, exactly where it should. No tape visible from this angle. No equipment. No sign that anything had happened here less than 12 hours ago. The forest had done a thorough job of agreeing to forget. The climb felt longer than it ever had. Each step rang out, loud and unfiltered. I paused twice to listen, expecting some answering sound from below or above. There was none. The tower didn't hum. It didn't vibrate. It behaved. Inside the cab, the air was cool and still. I set my pack down and stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. The smell was gone completely, pine and dust only. I turned on the desk lamp and watched the circle of light bloom across familiar surfaces. Nothing out of place. Nothing waiting. I logged the time. I logged the weather. My handwriting steadied as I went, muscle memory taking over. The act of writing drew a line between then and now that I needed. Outside, the forest settled. A breeze moved through the canopy, leaves whispering in overlapping layers. Ordinary sound, restored. At 8:14, the radio crackled. Not a voice, just a brief opening of the channel that let the night breathe through it. I waited, counted. When nothing followed, I marked the time on the scrap of paper I'd started using again. Not the official log. I didn't trust that book anymore. Felt watched. The horizon remained clear. No lights, no flicker. I scanned methodically, forcing my eyes to move in the patterns I'd been taught. Sector by sector. No smoke. No anomalies I could justify noting. The pressure behind my eyes stayed absent, and with it, some of the tension eased. That lasted until the sound began. It was faint at first, easy to miss. A low, intermittent vibration that didn't register as noise so much as sensation. I felt it through the soles of my boots, through the legs of the chair when I sat. It came and went, irregular, like someone testing a signal and pulling back. I stood and moved to the center of the cab, palms flat on the floorboards. The vibration strengthened slightly, then cut out. I waited for it to return. Didn't. The silence that followed felt provisional. At 9:02, something changed in the clearing. Not light, not movement, absence. The area directly beneath the tower seemed to lose depth, like a photograph with its contrast turned down. Edges softened, shadows flattened. I caught myself leaning forward and stopped, heart ticking faster. The instruction wasn't in effect anymore. That didn't matter. The habit held. The radio clicked again. This time, a voice followed. It wasn't the tired one. It wasn't the younger woman. It was the calm male voice from the first night, unchanged, as if no time had passed for him at all. He asked me to confirm my position. He didn't use my name. That felt deliberate. I confirmed. He told me there would be activity in the vicinity and that I should continue normal operations. The phrase landed differently now. Normal had been redefined without my input. When I asked what kind of activity, he said, residual. The word carried weight without explanation. Before I could press, the channel closed. The vibration returned, stronger this time, steady enough to count. 3 seconds on. 2 off. 3 on. It traveled up the tower legs and settled into the cab, setting the glass into a barely perceptible tremor. I focused on the horizon the way I'd been told, fixing on the ridgeline until my eyes watered. A shape moved at the edge of my vision, low and slow, not crossing the clearing, circling it. The movement was wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, like something following a boundary it could feel but not see. I did not turn my head. I let it pass through the periphery and go. The vibration stopped. At 9:37, there was a knock on the trapdoor. One knock, same as before, same weight behind it. I didn't answer. The handle didn't turn. Whoever was below seemed to wait, counting something I wasn't privy to. The pressure nudged behind my eyes, a warning more than a threat. I stayed still. The knock didn't repeat. Footsteps descended. I exhaled slowly, realizing I'd been holding my breath again. My hands shook when I reached for the mug on the desk. The coffee had gone cold hours ago. I drank it anyway, grounding myself in the bitterness. The rest of the hour passed without incident. The forest resumed its night rhythm. Insects started up. A distant call echoed and faded. The clearing's flatness eased, depth returning in increments so small I couldn't pinpoint when it finished. At 10:18, the radio crackled one last time. No voice, just a brief tone, deep and steady, the same one I'd heard the night before. It lasted exactly 5 seconds, then cut out cleanly. The vibration did not return. I wrote the time down and closed the notebook. Whatever residual meant, whatever phase we were in now, it wasn't something that required my participation beyond presence. That, I was beginning to understand, was the point. The tower wasn't there to protect me. It was there to make sure someone stayed above the clearing, eyes outward, attention disciplined, memory managed. I stayed on shift until midnight and then some, because leaving felt like breaking a rule I couldn't see written anywhere. When I finally allowed myself to sit back and rest, the forest felt stable again. Not safe, stable. The night held, and somewhere beneath the tower, something had learned the limits of where it was allowed to be. The hours after midnight thinned out, stretched long and quiet in a way that made each minute feel individually accounted for. The vibration didn't come back. The radio stayed silent. The forest settled into a version of stillness that felt earned, like it had passed some internal threshold and been allowed to rest. I remained alert anyway. That had become reflex. Sleep felt inappropriate, like closing your eyes during a briefing. I sat with my back against the wall, boots planted on the floor, eyes moving between the windows and the horizon, careful not to let them drift downward. The clearing beneath the tower looked ordinary again. Depth restored. Shadows behaving. If I hadn't seen what I'd seen earlier, I might have believed it. That was the problem. The night had taught me how convincing normal could be when it needed to be. At 12:41, the pressure returned. Not sharply, not as a warning, more like a reminder. A gentle increase, the sense of standing too close to something large without touching it. My ears rang softly, a high, thin tone that came and went when I swallowed. I focused on breathing, slow and shallow, and waited for it to either escalate or pass. Passed. When it did, something else took its place. A sound I hadn't heard before. Low, organic, not mechanical, not quite vocal. It traveled through the ground and up the tower legs, resolving into a faint resonance in the cab. It wasn't rhythmic. It wasn't patterned. It reminded me of wind moving through a confined space, but thicker, weighted. I didn't write it down. I watched the horizon instead, fixing on a notch in the ridge where rock cut cleanly against sky. The stars above it were steady, indifferent. I held on to that. At 1:12, the sound shifted. It thinned, stretched, then stopped altogether, like a breath being released. The forest responded a few seconds later. Insects resumed. A small animal moved through brush, careless now. Life testing the edges of safety and finding no immediate consequence. I felt the tension drain from my shoulders in a slow wave that left me exhausted. Not relieved, just empty. I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes for the first time since the shift began. I don't know how long they were closed. I didn't fall asleep. I would have known if I had. But time slipped anyway, the way it does when you stop measuring it. When I opened my eyes again, the sky had lightened almost imperceptibly. Not dawn, just the suggestion of it, a subtle dilution of black. That was when I noticed the change in sound. The tower was too quiet. Not the forest, the structure itself. The faint creaks and ticks that usually accompany thermal shift were absent. It felt as if the tower was holding itself rigid, resisting movement. I pressed my palm to the floorboards and felt nothing. No vibration, no hum, no response. At 2:03, the radio clicked on without warning. Static flooded the cab, louder than it had ever been, filling the space with a harsh rush that made me flinch. I grabbed the handset, heart hammering, and waited for a voice that didn't come. The static wavered, rose, then cut out abruptly, leaving a ringing silence behind. In that silence, I heard it. Movement below the tower. Not footsteps on the stairs. Not someone climbing. Something shifting in place, heavy and deliberate, accompanied by the sound of earth under pressure. I froze, breath shallow, eyes locked forward. The instruction wasn't in effect anymore. The habit was. The sound traveled, slow and controlled, circling the base. I could feel it more than hear it, a displacement of weight that the tower acknowledged with a barely perceptible sway. My stomach dropped. The structure wasn't designed to move like that. Not laterally, not without wind. The movement stopped. Seconds passed, then minutes. The pressure behind my eyes returned, stronger this time, and with it came a sense of proximity that made my skin prickle. Whatever was below wasn't testing boundaries anymore. It was occupying them. I focused on the horizon until my vision blurred. When the pressure peaked, it didn't break. It plateaued, held, then eased just enough to breathe again. The sound did not return. At 2:27, the radio came back to life. The tired voice, weaker now. He asked me to confirm that I was still in the cab and that I had not attempted to leave. His phrasing was precise. I confirmed both. There was relief in his exhale that he didn't bother hiding. "Good," he said. "We're past the critical window." I asked what that meant. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone flat. "It means it's staying where it is." The channel closed. I stayed where I was, every sense tuned outward, waiting for some sign that the night disagreed. None came. The forest held steady. The tower remained rigid, as if bracing against something it could feel but not see. The sky continued its slow shift toward morning. Stars dulled. Edges softened. The clearing beneath the tower looked unchanged, ordinary in a way that felt rehearsed. By the time the first real hint of dawn edged the ridge, the pressure had faded completely. The sound was gone. The tower creaked again, a familiar, comforting noise as temperature began to rise. I didn't relax. I understood now that what I'd been part of wasn't an event. It was maintenance, a cycle, something that would repeat on a schedule I wasn't allowed to see. As the light grew, the forest resumed its daytime performance, and the clearing accepted it without protest. Whatever had shifted beneath the tower had settled, content or constrained. I couldn't tell which. I stayed on watch until the sky fully committed to morning, eyes on the horizon, posture rigid, waiting for permission I knew wouldn't come. Part of me already understood what the final phase would look like. It wouldn't involve lights or voices or knocking. It would involve me being asked eventually to confirm that nothing happened at all.